Hi, welcome to theAnalysis-news. I'm Paul J. We'll be back in just a few seconds with Denis Gorbach, who's coming to us from Paris. He's a Ukrainian activist and academic, and he's going to talk to us about the current situation in Ukraine. Be back in just a few seconds. I've been wanting for some time to talk to a progressive Ukrainian about what's going on in Ukraine. And today I am joined by a Ukrainian academic and activist who's studied the Ukrainian working class, Ukrainian trade unions, and his name is Denis Gorbach. He's a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Political Studies, known as Sciences Po in Paris. His research focuses on the politics of the Ukrainian working class. He's a member of the editorial collective of Commons, a Ukrainian socialist website. Previously, he worked as an economic journalist in the Ukrainian press. Thanks very much for joining me, Denis.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, thanks very much for doing it. I know this is a hell of a time. When were you last in Ukraine?
Last time it was during my fieldwork, which I was doing in 2019. Afterwards, I didn't have a chance.
And you've been mostly living in Paris then for a while?
Afterwards, yes, for the last 3 years, mostly Paris, otherwise other cities of France.
So there's a lot of discussion in the West, or even around the world, that the reasons for the Russian invasion into Ukraine, they call it Putin's invasion more than they say Russia's invasion. I guess that's another question. But at any rate, that the expansion of NATO is the underlying cause of the invasion. You hear terms like, even in the left, a term I heard, which I found a little alarming, the way it was phrased, but a tactical error on Putin's part, an overreaction on Putin's part, but that the prime underlying cause of the conflict is the expansion of NATO. What's your assessment of that argument?
I mean, sadly, this narrative has been bought very much. It's very persuasive for a number of reasons for the global left and for the realist school of for more like rightish realists in the American foreign policy studies.
People like John Mearsheimer and
exactly. So these are quite unlikely bedfellows which concur on that, and it is all the more curious because this narrative, this explanation is not exactly the preferred explanation even for Putin himself. So even the Russian leadership has used this argument rather manipulatively during some period in the beginning of this year and in the end of last year. But in the days preceding the invasion, the last several speeches of Putin have completely abandoned this topic, instead focusing on the more nationalist view. So Putin spent several hours speaking into the camera about how Ukraine is an artificial entity created by the evil Bolsheviks and so on and so forth. So it was nothing about so-called security guarantees of Russia, but more about overall explicit desire to expand its own geopolitical area of influence and so on and so forth.
Well, I saw this, I have to say, rather bizarre meeting that Putin had with a group of stewardesses. I don't know if you saw this. It was a very strange thing because they looked more like models in stewardesses uniforms. They were, all stunningly beautiful. And they were about 15 or 20 of them around this big table, and Putin explaining why he's one of the stewardesses, if she is a stewardess, asks, why did this war begin? But there, his argument was primarily the threat from Ukrainian militarization, expansion of NATO. He even talks about if Ukraine was in NATO, or perhaps even if it wasn't, someday there could be missiles in Ukraine pointed at Russia. So it seems to me that's the main explanation I've been hearing, and I think what the Russian people have been hearing, no?
Yeah, so there is this narrative of Russia being constantly encircled. Yes, this is a part of the dominating discourse. It is not exactly the narrative that helps us understand the conflict. It helps to perhaps analytically distinguish two different scales, chronological scales, because if we think in decades, if we think in terms of the last half a century, in that sense, of course, NATO and more precisely the US, with its military and political influence, was certainly a force, has been a force that whose influence is extremely important for structuring the whole picture of the global capitalism and the global political conjuncture as well. In that sense, yes, it had the agency of the US, of the American imperialism, if you want to put it that way, certainly affected Putin's view of things as well as everything else in the world. However, if we want to look for reasons for the specifically Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and if we want to take a scale of the last, let's say, 20 years, it is safe to say that in this respect, the perspective of NATO, of Ukraine's NATO membership, has not been on the table at least since 2008, since the famous Bucharest summit, when the leaders of Ukraine, Georgia, and I believe Moldova filed a formal request for being granted a plan for NATO membership. And this request was not supported by the NATO. So despite basically the pleas from the President Yushchenko of Ukraine at that time, this was the very extremely pro-Western president. So at that point, it did become extremely clear for everyone, including Putin, that this is not going to happen, precisely because of the West's considerations for Putin's so-called security guarantees or zones of influence and so on. It is true that since then, especially since 2014, after the beginning of the war, actually, Ukraine has been basically pushed again. If we look at the development of these events, pushed by the actions by the Russian invasion into the arms of Washington in terms of political and military cooperation. This still does not make it any more probable that Ukraine would ever have been considered a member of the NATO. But there was this process of cooperation, of military cooperation, that has been growing closer and closer. And the public opinion in Ukraine has been warmer and warmer towards the NATO. So if around 2008, the share of Ukrainians who would be favorable to membership of NATO was like very, very small. So it was maybe around 20%, around that figure. Recently, in the recent years, it has grown up to 62%, and obviously after the invasion, it has so now it is extremely high. So
part of the argument goes, you kind of talked a bit about it, but the argument goes that even if NATO was never going to actually allow Ukraine to become a full member, there's the term now was a de facto member, people are saying, because of what is it, more than $1 billion of military support equipment, starting with Trump, then under Biden. Now, of course, that ain't the same because there's no Article 5. So I find that argument. But still, the extent of militarization of Ukraine, these people argue, was legitimately seen as a threat. They say the Americans would never allow a pro-Russian Canada to get so armed, or Mexico. So what was that not a provocation?
Well, I mean, it's all fine discussing security guarantees of Russia, which is entitled to have its legitimate security guarantees, which is not the case apparently for Ukraine, whose security guarantees have been basically discarded. So they existed in the form of the Budapest Memorandum from 1994. I mean, I'm sure you know this story. It was even mentioned by President Zelensky recently, just before the invasion, where he reminded that Ukraine refused to keep its nuclear weapons in exchange for the guarantees that then were basically trampled by Russia, and the recent history exactly shows what happens when Ukraine is demilitarized, because since the early 90s until the early 2010s, more than 2 decades, Ukraine has been exactly disarming itself. So because it's not exactly a very rich country, as you might guess, and its budget was structured consistently in the way that that made the army the less privileged receiver of funds, which led the country to the situation in which in 2014 the Russian forces annexed Crimea without much fuss, and then they were able to successfully establish their military and political domination over 2 breakaway regions, so to make them basically break away. So the only logical reason that Ukrainians logical lesson that Ukrainians take out of this whole history is that you should be armed to teeth. You should pick the strongest bully in the neighborhood, which happens to be the United States, to protect yourself from the bully right next to your door. Unfortunately, this is the Ukrainian perspective. This is the point of view of its security guarantees, if we want to speak in that language.
And why did, prior to the invasion or the lead up to it, why did Ukrainians think that Russia was the bully? And partly the whole issue of Donbas. What is your take on that? Because you would think at least some of the people in Donbas who have declared independence recently, they saw Russia as a defender, not a bully.
Well, there are two opposing views on the conflict around the Donbas, on the war that has started in 2014. Ukrainians, Ukrainian nationalists, react extremely angrily when you call the situation a civil war, civil conflict, because they only agree to acknowledge the agency of the Russian government, and the other side is only willing to acknowledge the agency of the working class, or however you might call them, the people who suddenly found their new national identity in the Donbas. Certainly, there are both dimensions to this story. There was certainly an inner conflict at the time of the Euromaidan of 2013-2014. There were people in the Donbas who reacted, who did not agree with what was happening in Kiev, but the situation would never have accelerated to the extent to which it did, were it not for the factor of Russia, which sent its troops and escalated the conflict to to this stage of actual war, of actual military hostilities?
I've talked to progressive Russians who are very opposed to the war, very opposed to the invasion, but they argue that the forces in Donbas, who, if I understand it correctly, at least in 2014, were just asking for a federated model of Ukraine to have sort of the rights of maybe a Quebec within a Canada, didn't get anywhere with that, and then started wanting a real autonomy, and then they get the Minsk agreement, which according to the progressive Russians I'm talking to, the Ukrainian government did not try to implement it all, which would have been respected the autonomy. And that generally, that there's a split even in the Russian left over the war, that a section of the Russian left see the Ukrainian government and the forces around it as so right-wing, and in fact suppressed the Ukrainian left, of which you're part of, that they're mixed about all this, because even though they don't like Putin and don't in any way see him as a progressive force, they see the Ukrainian government as a more right-wing force in this particular situation. But it all surrounds the issue of Donbas. And I know you grew up as in a Russian-speaking family. So what's your take on the truth of all this? Because it gets very contradictory.
Well, like I said, yes, we cannot deny. I mean, I will not deny the existence of a genuine popular participation in those uprisings at the early stage of 2014. Were they legitimate? I mean, it's so were they right to demand the federalization and whatnot, language rights, autonomy? Sure, that is in principle this sounds completely fine and legitimate, and in principle I agree, of course, that the Euromaidan, with its scary pictures, with its new government that did not find anything better to do in the very first days after it seized power than to dismantle the law about languages, which was a purely symbolic step. I mean, it didn't change anything in practice, but it did create a certain atmosphere, which was.
So for people who don't know, this was a law that would have outlawed the use of Russian. I don't think it ever was implemented, but that's sort of expressed an attitude.
I mean, if you want, we can actually go slightly back even in this regard, if you feel it is
important. Go ahead.
About the languages. So the whole thing with so in principle, Ukraine is a heterogeneous country linguistically and ethnically. It doesn't make it exotic, doesn't make it illegitimate. There are plenty of countries like that. And it was not always a political issue. It has become politicized explicitly starting only from the 2000s, when these identities, so the competition of so-called ethnic Ukrainian identity and so-called East Slavic, so more kind of post-imperial identity with which emphasized Russian language and Orthodox Church and Soviet symbolism. This competition between these two national projects was the artifact imposed by the logic of parliamentary competition in the 2000s. So this was the framework found by the oligarchic forces, which was the easiest for them to use for their competition in the parliamentary politics, in the party politics. Afterwards, this framework has got its logic, the logic of its own, which means that the spiral of polarization started to unfold, and eventually it started getting out of the control of these politicians themselves. In 2012, 2012, we had the President Yanukovych, which was the embodiment of this pro-Russian or East Slavic identity. And in order to reinforce his political domination, he bet on the further polarization by passing the law on languages, which did not change basically anything, in fact, but it was sold to the population as this big change, which finally establishes historical justice for the Russian speakers. In fact, this was basically about, I don't know, the language on the beer bottles, so whether you should double it, like in Canada, for example. So stuff which does not have much to do. So it definitely was not about making everyone speak one language or the other, but it led to great celebrations on the part of the pro-Russian politicians and to great protests, the outrage, not strikes, but pickets on the part of the Ukrainian nationalists. Then 1.5 years later, you have this revolution. You have this the politicians representing the other identitarian camp seizing the power, and then what they do, they grab this useless law and they cancel it, like very publicly, very loudly, which again does not change anything in the practical functioning of the languages. Still, even now in Ukraine, you can speak like most of Ukrainian army, in fact, is Russophone, speaks Russian. So it's not outlawed or anything, but it sends a signal. This signal is perceived with triumph by one camp and with horror by the other camp. So the polarization makes another step. The Ukrainian nationalists say, yeah, we will send our militarized units to Crimea to show them who's the boss here. Obviously, this is immediately grabbed on and reproduced in the internet to mobilize Russian speakers in Crimea and elsewhere. So you have this identitarian conflict which gets out of control. And which allows finally foreign force to intervene on the grounds of protecting the Russian speakers from the genocide and etc. etc.
The Ukrainian nationalists, many of them are virtual or even overt Nazis. And again, my Russian friends tell me there was good reason to fear what they might have done or did do in Crimea. Thousands of people apparently over that last 8 years were killed in Donbas, they say, by these Ukrainian nationalist forces in the Ukrainian military. And then you combine that with this new militarization of Ukraine. That there was reason to believe that this buildup of Ukrainian military prior to the buildup of the Russian encirclement and then invasion, that there was reason for Russia to believe that this rearming, if you can say, Ukrainian military might try to go into Donbas and crush the movement for autonomy and independence. Was that a legitimate concern on Russia's part?
Okay, you see, I have not even exactly got your intention initially when you first asked this question, because this is exactly the kind of this discourse is evidently omnipresent in Russia, but it is so far from what people were speaking about and how they saw the situation in Ukraine over the last year.
This is what, amongst large sections of the left all around the world, is sort of what one is hearing.
I mean, I'm not going to be an advocate of whatever nationalist bullshit Ukrainian government after the Euromaidan and up to maybe now has been doing. So I'm not going to explain that everything that it's right in those language laws and everything, but I find it utterly ridiculous, the very idea that Ukraine at any point in its recent history, whether under the President Zelensky or under more nationalist, certainly very nationalist President Poroshenko previously, was ever intending seriously to invade Crimea, to take it by force, Crimea or the Donbas. I mean, the differential in forces now, when we have the Russian full-scale invasion is already muddling on 3 weeks. And the whole world is kind of looking at it in disbelief. How come the Russian army seems to be so weak? What has happened to all our analysis? Now we might we might have the new information to reconsider. But so far, this was a common knowledge in the whole world, including in Ukraine, that no, Russia is completely unbeatable, and it would be a suicide for anyone who would want to do that. So yes, there was this remilitarization because I mean, you can imagine a country that spends 8 years in this situation of low intensity war, because this was not a frozen conflict. There were deaths, if not every day, certainly every week. So yes, there was certainly the militarization of the economy, and the army was building up, but hardly even among the most radical nationalists, hardly even the super Nazi Ukrainian far right flank would ever dream of actually launching an offensive against Russian-controlled territories.
So if it's not NATO expansion in reality that motivates this invasion, and I've always thought that too, because it was clear Ukraine could never get into NATO, and there's a unique consensus in NATO to allow a new country, and I think enough countries had made it very clear that they were never going to let Ukraine into NATO. And if the de facto, as people call it, NATOization of Ukraine, the military buildup, it was certainly there, but if it's not an actual threat to Russia in an offensive way, and you're saying even to Donbas, not a threat, and if defense of and that thus then the defense of Donbas isn't really a motivating factor for the invasion, then what the hell is? What is this about?
I'm not. I don't know if there is the political scientist Ilya Matveyev among your Russian friends, your Russian leftist friends. If not, I highly recommend. So he's a very bright person. And I owe it to him this argument that it seems that we all have been kind of blind to the possibility of real ideological politics existing, especially in the post-Soviet space, because this part of the world, ever after the breakup of the Soviet Union, has been utterly cynical in terms of ideologies. So I mean, this is true for the population. Everybody perceives politics in principle and ideologies in principle as only as smoke and mirrors, as lies which only are used to mask real intentions, which lie certainly somewhere in the sphere of economic control. But this whole story seems to show us that how strangely as it may seem, Russian leadership is not crazy. No, it acts rationally from the point of view of its ideologized worldview, the worldview that is informed by the accent on by the agenda of restoration of the military and political might of the empire, even if it comes at the cost of economy, of well-being, of economic well-being, and at the cost of political good standing. So now we can see that Russian government has made conscious steps towards its self-marginalizing on the political scene, but it is a rational step within this framework of the empire that famously, as the expression goes, stands up from its knees, that shows its military might, that is not afraid to face the ultimate boss of the United States and so on. So I think we face the return of the ideology to this part of the world.
But certainly underpinning that, and I'll say this twice, I am not comparing Putin to Hitler. And the invasion of Ukraine, while I think is a violation of international law, and I emphasize that, whereas some people are paying lip service to that. You know, I remember a conversation before the Iraq War, where one of my guests on a show I had was saying to an Iraqi who was saying, you got to help us overthrow Saddam because he's such a terrible dictator. And my guest said, you know what, that's your problem. My problem is international law. My problem is the world doesn't unravel into total militarized chaos. So you want to get rid of Saddam, go ahead, but don't ask us to completely break down international law that was established after World War II. So that's I have three concerns here. One, international law, which I think has been violated grossly. Two, everything I look at these days, I look at the issue of climate change as the most important critical threat we have. And all of this is completely taken the most recent IPCC report off the table for even talking about, a report that's apocalyptic in its language. And three, the threat of nuclear war, because whatever the hell happens in Ukraine, we're getting closer to the threat of nuclear war. Accidental, I doubt deliberate, but when you start getting this tense, shit happens. And we don't have room for shit happens with this. But all that being said, the underlying reasons have to be economic. And it seems to me, I think anyway, it's very similar to the rise of fascism in Germany, in the sense that Germany deserved to be a major power of Europe. And after World War I, the West didn't want it to be, of course, until they did. They wanted to point it at the Soviet Union. And they helped those forces within Germany that they thought were so anti-communist, so fascist, that it would serve them. And then, of course, be careful what you wish for. But this refusal of the West to recognize that Russia has to have a space within the capitalist world, is assuming you want a capitalist world, and I don't, but we got one. Russia deserves to be a major power of Europe, including probably having more access to the European markets than the United States does. It's not a bloody European country. I mean, clearly that's got to be the base of which this great need to reinvigorate, to call upon all the ideology of empire has to rest, no?
Well, with Germany, the story is very well known, and I mean it's very well analyzed in terms of Marxist conceptual apparatus, right? So you have all this talk of financial capital, of imperialism in the Lenin sense of finances expanding and so on and so forth. In this sense, so far at least, it's been hard for me to grasp Russian imperialism in these classical terms. although if you speak about about the lost about the humiliation of the empire, this is certainly true. The ambitions that are frustrated, the zones of influence or zones of exclusive interests that are negated, and so on. Certainly, this is all happening. This is all taking place. In terms of purely economic dimension, what we can say for sure is this the importance of Ukraine economically for Russia. We have seen that. Well, basically, we can trace it back to the very beginning of the independent existence of Ukraine in 1991, when it was part of the common of the shared economic space, and it had trouble leaving it. And then the reintegrationist attempts that began in around 2010, 2011 with the projects of Eurasian Economic Union, which it was supposed to become an entity akin to the European Union, so a competing entity, geopolitical and geoeconomic entity. The Russia Putin was adamant in trying to get Ukraine into that union, and because Ukraine is a metallurgical producer that competes with Russia currently, it competes with Russia in agrarian on the agrarian commodity markets. If these two major producers in its are joined into one, certainly it will of course be a major improvement in terms of for the Russia in terms of trade, for its economic standing globally. And this is precisely why Ukrainian ruling class was so hesitant, despite its cultural proximity, despite the fact that it was so the Ukrainian oligarchs have been mostly promoting this pro-Russian, this so-called East Slavic identity on the internal political scene, but they were very reluctant to agree to any of these integrationist projects that would, because these projects did not give them any promises of survival, because if you have to combine the two powers, then it is Russian bourgeoisie that gets the goods, and Ukrainian bourgeoisie is not does not get any place of its own in this picture. So this is what I could say in terms of economy. Yeah.
You talked earlier about agency, and most of the analysis that gets done everywhere is about the interest and motivations of the Russians, the interest and motivation of the Americans. But there isn't a heck of a lot of talk about the interest and motivation of the Ukrainians. These days, Zelensky is sort of the hero standing up to the brutes. Talk about first of all, I want to really talk about the Ukrainian people, but let's first start with the Ukrainian oligarchy, who don't get all that much talked about these days. They're not monolithic, they have their own agendas, and maybe the analysis really should start from them.
So there is this weird faction, or rather weird formation of the ruling class, which is typical for the post-Soviet space. I mean, elsewhere oligarchs are a rude word, and this is how I see it is perceived today in the Anglosphere, also in France. People don't understand why you're calling them oligarchs. You are just probably mad at them. That's why I use this word.
Well, let me just say, Bernie Sanders correctly called American billionaires oligarchs. So when I say oligarchs, I'm including Americans.
I mean, so in places like Russia and Ukraine, oligarchs are a term which is more defined, which is more strict and even neutral. So it simply means someone who has enormous concentration of wealth, who uses this wealth this economic wealth to conserve enormous amount of political power, and the two depend on each other. So this is where perhaps I would see, in fact, difference between the super rich and super politically powerful people in the US.
I don't think so different, but that's another topic. Let's.
So, I mean, if we speak, if we use the liberal language, the language of liberal economists, this is about the property rights, because in Ukraine, the oligarchs, if they fall out of grace, they can be, I mean, extinguished economically as well, which might probably not be the case in the US.
Yeah, not so easy.
So this is the definition of oligarchy. So people who own political and economic power. These two types of capital are used interchangeably to support each other, and whose property is guaranteed by their proximity to the political center of gravity. This first this class was first it saw the day in the light of the day in Russia in the 90s after the privatization, because Russia privatized more abruptly. It was much more quick and brutal story in Russia than in Ukraine. Because already by 1996 you had this re-election of Yeltsin, which was basically organized, massively falsified by these oligarchs. In Ukraine, this story begins rather in the second presidential term of the President Kuchma, so in the first half of the 2000s, when this aforementioned president admitted many times explicitly that he had in mind the creation of a national bourgeoisie, the creation of a national property class, and this is precisely for this, with this vision in mind, that he conducted privatization by limiting access to foreign bidders, by selling assets, selling the industrial assets very cheaply to insiders. So, for example, one of the oligarchs is his son-in-law, and thereby creating the ruling class. Because before that there was only him. So there was the political administration and the industrial administration, this known as red directors, so the directors of state-owned factories. After the privatization, we've got this new elite of oligarchs, so the super rich people that control basically all the economy, and there is only, I mean, you can count them on the fingers of one hand, maximum two hands. Contrary to Russia, this class has not been shifted, has not been evacuated out of political competition, because currently there are still certainly oligarchs in Russia, but there is, I mean, they certainly participate probably in some kind of politics, but in a very implicit manner, some undercover, behind the scenes negotiations. In Ukraine, starting from the 2000s, we see the system which has been called oligarchic democracy in this somewhat paradoxical manner. So the parliamentary democracy, which is nevertheless mostly the competition of political machines controlled by the oligarchs. So the parties are not, grassroots parties are not what you have elsewhere. These are vertical mechanisms that are glued by the forces of patronage, of clientelism, and so on. and so it happened, so it goes. Yes. So the other important factor in Ukraine, which is not the case anymore in Russia, is media, the control over the media. In Russia, the competition between the media has been, I think, has evaporated already in the early Putin years. In Ukraine, this is still the case that an oligarch is basically a person who is not only wealthy and politically influential, but also a person who is mediatically influential, who owns at least one TV channel. And so this competition is perpetuated in the public sphere by way of competing narratives in the media.
We're going to do a part 2 of this conversation, which we're going to post as quickly as we can after part 1. But just before we end it here, I just want to kind of get back to the real world here, because once one gets into the analysis of the situation, it's easy to kind of lose sight of the savagery of the invasion and the suffering of the people. So just to end this part, just what are you hearing about what's happening now? And then in part 2, we're going to continue sort of talking about the history, and we're going to talk about just what happened in 2014. But first of all, what are you hearing about what's happening on the ground?
So from the latest reports, it looks like Kiev is still under artillery shelling episodically. I mean, not constantly, but there are residential districts in Kiev that are under fire, and it is much more so the case for Kharkiv, which is incidentally the most Russophone, the most Russian-speaking city in Ukraine, in the east, which has been under. It is still not under siege, not besieged yet, but the Russian forces are trying to close in around it, and there is a massive destruction there. And the third place where it's been extremely hot currently is Mariupol, a port city in southeastern Ukraine, which is besieged, which is extremely important strategically for Russians to capture. Therefore, this is currently the scene of the most brutal war crimes. Yeah.
So in part 2, we're going to continue some of the historical conversation, as well as some of the questions of just what motivated the invasion, and what's happening in terms of the politics amongst the people, which is not monolithic either. So please join us for part 2 of this the conversation, and thanks for joining us.